think we should start. This class is not only preparing for success at NFL Nationals. Generally, it's just going to be like my philosophy on how to do preparation and debate for traditional debate, specifically NFL style, but any tournament that's like that is what this is about. So, first thing that you always start with when you get a resolution is with reading and research, and it's absolutely the same for NSDA. Those of you who are progressive debaters who have perhaps been frustrated by, or coaches whose progressive debaters have been frustrated by the NSDA, I think this is one of the biggest strong points for TOC debaters doing well at NFL, is I think that in general progressive debaters are better researchers than traditional debaters. They do more research, they have more of it. However, for the NSDA, I think more than any other tournament, reading evidence is key, more than just cutting cards. I think that a lot of time we have instinct when we do research to just cut quotable things, when I think it's pretty important to just do a lot of reading about the topic and just see what people have to say, even if it's not necessarily quotable. Because at NSDA, you just don't get to read as many cards as you do at another tournament. You don't get to speak as fast, you have to do more analytical warranting, you can't really read cards in the 2NR, right? So there are a lot of reasons why you can't get as many cards on the flow as you would at a lot of other tournaments, which means it's very important when you're doing your research to not just cut the cards, but also internalize the ideas. So understand the points the author is making, be able to summarize them, be able to explain them. So that's what you're doing during the reading and research period. The same thing you're doing for every topic, trying to come up with basic ideas, trying to come up with quotable evidence, but also perhaps different, trying to internalize that evidence and be able to use it out of context of the card itself. But that is not so much of a difference. And that should start as soon as you possibly can, as soon as you get the resolution. Because the more you do there, the more it pays off once you actually get to the tournament. Then we have to get into the brainstorming process. And this is where I think NSDA starts to be a little bit different from a lot of other tournaments. Because I'm a great believer that any brainstorming for a tournament like NFL Nationals should take place as much as possible out of the context of debate. So intelligent people who are not debaters are your best friends once a traditional topic, or especially NFL, rolls around. Because I think the best form of preparation you can possibly have for the tournament is spending as much time as you can talking and arguing about the subject with non-debaters. Because they're the ones who are going to come up with the sort of intuitive, obvious arguments that we sometimes miss because we're so concerned about how this links into our framework and whether it's strategically sound. Sometimes we miss the obvious arguments that can win tournaments. Right? So this year at the NSDA, one of the more problematic arguments, which I don't actually think was a great argument and didn't end up doing amazing things, but one of the strong arguments on the topic, it was about whether or not we have an obligation, whether we're guilty for not acting to prevent injustice. And one of the arguments was, okay, but what if by acting we might make the situation worse? Can you blame someone for not acting if they're trying to do it in good faith, if they're honestly trying to help by not acting? And this put a lot of debaters into a really thorny situation because they couldn't really explain why that should be the case. And I think that that's an argument that comes up pretty quickly if you just talk about the topic with people, but that we went like 2 weeks of prep without realizing because we were just prepping with each other. And then as soon as I started talking to my parents about the resolution, my mom goes, oh, but what if you make it worse, right? What if you just add more attention to the situation? Like, oh, that's kind of an important thing. So taking as much time as you can, talking to non-debaters during the brainstorming process, before the tournament, as much as you can, talk about the topic with people who aren't competing on the topic, because they will have different ideas. Then you need to brainstorm your full list of arguments. You need to think about those arguments and rank those arguments based both on how well supported they are in the topic literature, and also how intuitively compelling they are. And I think that's a particularly important one. Because if your arguments don't feel important, it doesn't matter if there's a lot written about them necessarily, because they're just not going to feel terribly important, right? So, for instance, on this topic, the handguns topic, if you find a massive amount of literature on exactly how many jobs we'll lose, but it's not a huge number, then yeah, it's a very well-supported argument, right? Very grounded in topic literature, but it's not going to carry a lot of intuitive weight, because I think when people debate gun control, one of the things they don't necessarily think is, oh, well, how many people will be unemployed, right? It's not necessarily an intuitively compelling argument. And so then once you do that, once you have your arguments, once you've thought about which are intuitively compelling, which are strategically sound, which have research base, then you get into the actual argument writing process. And now we're on to case construction. This is where we should talk for a while. I think one of the hardest things, and the reason I have these 3 words on the board, is I think that what nationals really comes down to at the end of the day is being able to make arguments that are intuitively compelling and that are understandable, right? That make sense to your judges, that you can explain to your judges, and that are immediately and intuitively important to your judges, right? If you can't, and that's why I think that the layperson check is such a useful ally. If you can't get an average intelligent person to care about your arguments, then they're not arguments that are going to win at NFL. Right? You have to be able to get normal people to understand it without appealing to 6 reasons to prefer, or a better framework, or the fact that they dropped something. Right? You have to be able to make the arguments themselves stand their own from other people. Second is just sort of bookkeeping. You basically have to format everything in value criteria and contention format. You will get some rounds where you have progressive judges. Don't count on them, right? Just run the value criteria and contention format. If at the end of time we need to, we can talk a little bit more about actual framework construction, but I know there have been a lot of other lectures on that, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but if that's something that you have been struggling with as far as the style goes, we can talk about it at the end. But for now, one thing I do want to say is that progressive debaters often think that cards don't matter that much at nationals. I have talked to debaters that will remain unnamed, although you probably know them, who were of the opinion that you only needed a couple of cards total for each side. Like, yeah, you have 3 or 4 AF cards and a couple of neg cards. No, that's not how NFL works. Cards are just as important, well, maybe not quite, but very, very valuable at nationals. Your cases still need to be heavily grounded in research and evidence, and your rebuttals, when possible, it's nice to include evidence. It's still very important. What I will say is that analytically warranted cards are important at nationals, right? Because you still want to be able to have the credibility of citing lots of authors, of setting up your case in that manner, but having cards that also explain things in a way that your judges can understand kills 2 birds with one stone, right? It gives you your evidence, it gives you your warrants, it gives you the power of that author name, but it also explains things to your judge in ways that they can understand. When I write cases for nationals, and at some point we can maybe look at one if you guys are interested, I write it in tag card format, just like I think a lot of progressive debaters do. Contention 1, tagline, tag card, impact. Contention 2, tagline, tag card, impact, right? I write it in the same format. It's just the way you pick your cards is slightly different now, because you need those cards to be understandable by the judges. So it's a slightly different form of research than you might do for another tournament. But don't make the mistake of thinking that it's not research, because it very much still is, and it's still important. By the way, at any point, since it's such a small room, just flag me down if you have questions about anything, and we can talk about it. Don't be shy. So next up in the whole process is block construction. This is another thing I hear. I can't read my blocks at NSDA, so I don't write any. I just make arguments in the rebuttals. Bad idea. You are correct. I do not recommend reading lots of blocks at NSDA. In fact, other than cards, which you won't necessarily read a ton of, I do not recommend reading any rebuttals at NSDA. I think that all of it should be spoken from the flow and from your memory. That being said, you still need to write blocks just as much as you would for any other tournament, be it TOC or otherwise. The way you prioritize those blocks will, however, be slightly different, right? You need to bear in mind you are going to a traditional tournament when you write your blocks. So your blocks are going to be towards topical arguments and frameworks. You don't need to have back files on SCEP prepped out specifically for NSDA, right? What you need is fresh blocks to topical arguments and frameworks that go along with those arguments. And another thing for NSDA blocks, no spreading, right? No spreading in the rebuttals, which means it's absolutely quality over quantity as far as blocks go, right? I fell into this trap a lot in my sophomore year when I was really excited. Blocks were kind of a new concept to me. I really wanted to be prepared for the tournament, and I had like 15 answers to everything that I thought was important. You can't read more than 3 answers to something unless it's an extreme situation. And oftentimes you can't even read 3 answers to something. You read 2, maybe even 1. 3 is better. But once you get past 3 answers to something, you get really diminishing returns. So a lot of times I see debaters when they're saying like, okay, I need blocks towards block. And you're like, 1, tacit consent, 2, rights confliction, 3, he's an old guy that doesn't apply anymore, 4, da-da-da, 5, da-da-da, right? They think of as many things as they can. It's a bad idea. Spend time on each one and try to make them the best ones you can, right? It's absolutely a matter of quality over quantity. I've seen people destroy frameworks at nationals with 1 answer to, because that 1 answer was good, they made it well, and they could defend it, right? The entire idea of I will read 6 answers to, none of them will be good, they'll drop the 4th one, and I'll win with that, might fly at some tournaments, but it doesn't fly at NFL, not very well anyway. The next thing you need to do is any of your carded rebuttals. You need to practice explaining. Again, this is going to be a common theme you might notice. You need to practice explaining those carded rebuttals to lay people, because one of the most common adaptations I would make at nationals is every once in a while you would get rounds where it didn't really look like you wanted to read cards in rebuttals. And more commonly, you couldn't read that many cards because you had to go slower, which means that for any carded block, you need to be able to make the same block without the card. So you need to be able to switch easily back and forth between answers to with cards and answers to without cards. And that means understanding and stealing warrants from the cards themselves. The author should explain it, and you should also be able to explain it. And so that's what I mean at the bottom there, when I talk about internalizing carded rebuttals. You need to be able to, without the card, from the memory and from your flow, make the argument without reading. So next up, the extensions. This was a new concept to me this year, and I loved it. It was very valuable. Surrogate debaters will laugh at me because that's one of the core concepts. So extensions are, of course, absolutely still around in traditional LD. But I'm a great believer in writing out your extensions for your cases, particularly for this tournament. They are going to be analytical extensions, right? You're not going to extend, read a new card, and do a big impact off it. It's not as flashy an affair as extending can be at some tournaments. But I very heavily recommend writing extensions for all of your cases and writing 2 sets of extensions for all of your cases. This is another one of the most common pieces of adaptation I did this year. Is in front of some judges who have heavy flows, you can extend specific cards, and that's the best way to do it. That's how I prefer to judge. I think a lot of judges prefer extending cards. Not all judges are going to be with you, right? Not all judges will have the card names on their flow, which means you also need a set of extensions that just extend your contentions, your value, and your criterion, because those will be on the flow. As far as your extensions go, it's just like extending at any other tournament, right? You need a clean summary of the argument and the impact, right? You need to extend the claim, extend the warrant, and extend the impact. Writing these out and practicing them is very, very important, because one of the highest values, well, one of the most important things at the NSDA is clarity and crystallization, right? Judges need to be told exactly what to vote on. And however good your extensions are kind of dictates how easy it is for you to do that in the round. If in the 1AR you have clear, clean extensions to your contentions and your framework, then the 2AR gets really easy because you just have to build on what you already built in the 1AR. If in the 1AR you spend 20 seconds flailing around trying to re-explain your contention 1, and you don't have time to extend contention 2 and 3, and you start dropping stuff, it gets really ugly. So having clean, efficient extensions is important. What we always say in my team is that as far as writing extensions goes, you write the extension, and then you cut it in half, and then you cut it in half again, and then if you're on the AF, you cut it in half again. Basically, you start by writing a paragraph, then you get it down to 4 sentences, then you get it down to 2 sentences, and then if you're on the affirmative, you get it down to 1 sentence, right? You make it as word efficient as it can be without losing meaning. The next thing I would bring up is that you don't read these extensions within your rounds. I think shuffling paper and trying to keep them organized oftentimes is actually more trouble than it's worth and looks very bad for the large numbers of judges that care a lot about presentation skills. So just like your cards and your blocks, you need to be able to internalize your extensions. I would always print my extensions. I would always have them with me in round. I would look at them during my prep time, but I would never read them during my speeches. That had to be me being able to explain the extension. And it's not necessarily memorizing the extension. It's just being able to do it quickly, cleanly, and efficiently in round without actually having to read them. Any questions so far? Because this might be a little...
Do you actually say the word extend, or do you say remember my analysis?
Good question. So jargon adaptation is an important thing as far as nationals go. My general rule of thumb is ideally at nationals, you find a center ground and you don't actually adapt very much round to round. That doesn't end up working, you kind of have to adapt round to round. Typically, if I was reading my carded extensions, I would say extend. If I was reading my non-carded extensions, I would use a substitute word. Like, the general one I went to was blank still stands. So, contention 1 still stands. And then I would read the little extension. Right? My value still stands, read the little extension. Which is actually not much less efficient than extend my value. My value still stands, same number of words. So later on in the tournament, I actually just got into the habit of always doing that. I just stopped saying extend, because once you get panels of judges and big panels of judges, it's easier to just do the substitute phrasing, because circuit judges might roll their eyes a little that you're dancing around the word extend, but they won't vote you down for it, whereas judges that don't understand what extend means might. Good question, though. So now we're on to practice. Coaches, take note. As far as practice debate goes, one pitfall I see is that debaters will think about how to adapt. They'll sort of have a general idea that they need to adapt once they get there. But then they'll do practice rounds against non-progressive opponents in front of progressive judges, which are their coaches, and their coaches will give progressive feedback. That's a pretty bad way to practice adaptation, right? Adaptation isn't just something that you can do. It takes a lot of time to practice, which means that, you have to be able to find coaches who can do this. It's not easy to do. You have to put on your traditional judge hat and try to do the best impersonation you can of someone who thinks like traditional debate. And that can be a very tricky exercise, because if you get it wrong, you can teach people bad habits. But as close as you can, it's good to have a variance of styles. One of the things that I was most fortunate with in my practice debates is we would meet with the other qualifiers from throughout the state, and we would have practice rounds. And their coaches just legitimately had a number of different styles. Some of them were lay, some of them were traditional, and my coach was more progressive. And so it sort of simulated nationals, where in our practice rounds, we would have multiple different perspectives as far as coaching and judging goes. But if you're from a progressive district going to NSDA, you can't, if you just practice with the same coaches and the same judges and you don't change anything, you won't get the practice you need to actually do well at the tournament. You have to simulate the tournament. I also believe in holding entirely lay rounds, having your practice rounds in front of purely lay judges. You probably won't ever hit or get a purely lay judge at nationals, at least I hope not. They do their best. But the feedback that purely lay judges give can be really interesting, because sometimes they'll tell you that they voted on something that you had no idea would ever matter in a round. And that can be pretty illuminating. I encourage you not to just disregard that feedback as the voice of the uneducated, but take that as a pressure gauge. Which of your arguments are the most easy to understand? Because probably what they're voting on is whatever the most intuitive, understandable, and compelling of your arguments is. And so it can be quite valuable, right? If you make some argument about fairness and you think, it's kind of there, maybe I'll extend it in a couple of rounds, might be important. And then 3 different lay people say, that's such a cool argument, that's what I voted on. It's worth making a bigger part of your case. It's worth spending more time on. This is more logistical. Debate the broadest selection of people you can, debate people from different styles, debate all the people from your district if you can. If possible, especially in a state like Texas, debate people from different districts. I think one of the things that I was most fortunate with as far as my own debate career went is that Oklahoma was very willing to have statewide practice sessions for NFL qualifiers. Those days were incredibly valuable because it helps avoid sort of groupthink about debate arguments. You know, you and your immediate team, or perhaps a couple other schools, will have all of your ideas, and you get sort of wrapped up in this little microcosm of a debate world. And then as soon as that hits with another little microcosm, you learn a lot as far as what other people thought the resolution was about. And then lastly, as far as practice goes, you've got to practice at slow speed, you've got to practice with minimal jargon, you've got to practice with full presentation, and all that fun stuff. This year, I messed up, and I practiced with jargon because my opponents and my coach, we use jargon, and Oklahoma uses a fair amount of jargon. So I was practicing the entire lead up, saying cross apply, saying extend, saying drop, saying all these things that we're used to. And when I got to the tournament, it really tripped me up the first 3 or 4 rounds, trying to get all that out of my system. Unfortunately, it didn't end up costing me, but it's a major pitfall, right? The little things you don't think of that can end up making the difference in close rounds. If you're stumbling over yourself because you start to say extend and then try to remember what you're supposed to say instead, that can be enough to mess you up in a close round. So learn the habits before the tournament. Don't try to wait until the tournament to start adapting. And then the most important slide, which is practice explaining things. Debaters can be shockingly bad at explaining things, which is strange considering the nature of the event, but this is a universal problem, not particular to any one style of debate. We can get wrapped up in the details of debate and how we debate and the nitty-gritty, and we can forget that debate is about explaining things to people and to judges. If you're used to having judges that have already heard your arguments before, sometimes you might not even have really encountered the concept of having to explain things, right? If you always run femcase on a circuit with debaters who have read all the feminist literature and coaches who have read all the feminist literature and understand everything you're saying, they just sort of download everything they know when you tag the argument. That doesn't happen as much at the NSDA. It doesn't happen because you have so many different styles coming together into one tournament, which means you need to explain, they assume that your arguments are not ones that the judge has thought of or that your opponent has thought of. And so I'm a great believer in taking the time to very deliberately practice explaining things to people, preferably not just your coaches and your team. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but honestly, I am fully convinced that the only way I ever had success at nationals is because my family spent a huge amount of time talking to me about the resolution. And I think that time was as or more valuable than any of the actual practice rounds I put in, because it kept me thinking, it kept me explaining, and it forced me to learn to boil down debate speak into arguments that people could understand and that people could find compelling. And if you can speak in that language, that's a universally understood language. Doesn't matter what judge you have in the back of the room. If you can speak in ways that are universally understandable, then you will do well. So practice explaining things. Think of it like speed drills. Think of it like pen drills. It's one of those things that you have to do in order to learn the basic skills as far as doing all of the tournament goes. So then after all of this process, we get into the rewriting process. I typically like to do this maybe, say, a week and a half out from the tournament. I don't really like to do very much rewriting in the last week run-up. I don't think it gives you enough time. However, I have ended up doing that. So the rewriting process is important. You rewrite your arguments to make them more intuitive, to make them more understandable, and to make them more compelling. So if you're having a lot of trouble articulating one of your link chains to one of your late check people, then rewrite the argument, redo the link chains, try to figure out a way to make it a little bit easier to understand. The rewriting process, I think, is one that debaters sometimes skip. I think it's always best practice no matter what tournament you're going to, but I think it's particularly important for the NSDA. I guess 3 years ago was probably the worst case of this, but the affirmative case I ended up taking to nationals had been substantially overhauled 4 or 5 times by the time I actually read it in front of a judge. because I just kept realizing that certain parts of it weren't making sense to people, and that I needed to rewrite it, instead of just trying to technique my way through whatever the flaws with that case were. So rewriting process is worth it. Spend a lot of time on it. Then once you get to the tournament, there are a few things that trip a lot of people up because they're weird and they're hard to understand. And the first of those things is the big book of judge paradigms they give you. There's a bit of a code to judge paradigms at the NSDA. So they give it to you in this format where it's like, what's your experience with LD? How many rounds have you judged? On a scale of 1 to 7, what's your speed preference? Do you care about speed? Will you vote kids down for going too fast? How important is the value, how important is the criterion? Are value and criterion necessary? How important is evidence? How do you decide the round? How well do you flow? Right, basic questions like that. Some of this is really useful, some of this is the opposite of useful. I think that the judge experience section is by far the most useful part of the paradigm, right? If you get someone who says that they're an experienced speech coach, and that's it, and they tell you that a 7 on speed, a 7 on evidence, don't require value criterion, and keep a rigorous flow, they are lying to you. That is not how they judge, right? At least probably. That's the part that people don't lie about, right? People are very honest about, like, yeah, you can trust what people say about their experience. People in very good faith will just not have an accurate estimation of their abilities as a judge or how they actually decide the round, right? People who haven't heard of spreading will say, yeah, you can go 5, you can go 6, you can talk pretty fast to me. And then you spread and they don't understand a word of it because what they actually meant was you can go a 2 on speed, right? These things are a little subjective and you can't assume that every judge thinks of 1 and a 7 the same as you do. But the judge experience section is absolute. What they've coached, what they've judged, what they competed in, how many rounds they've judged. That, I think, is really easy. The way I spot lay judges isn't by what they put on the paradigm, right? You get lay judges who give you a 5 on speed and say they take some flow. The way you tell lay judges is based on what they've done. If they've judged 0 rounds and they're a speech coach or a community teacher or something, that makes them a lay judge, right? That's the part that you base your judgments on, not necessarily other things. Now, I've already talked about the problems with the speed section. It can be somewhat useful. I don't really want to base too much decision on it. Generally, though, if you're getting 2s and 3s on speed and your judges tell you that it matters, you need to go pretty slow. The jargon one is quite useful. It's jargon is either acceptable, should be kept to a minimum, or unacceptable. Jargon should be kept to a minimum is overwhelmingly the most common of the judge paradigms. I think like 80 to 90% of my rounds have at least one judge that says keep jargon to a minimum, which means that should be your general rule of thumb when you're practicing for the tournament, right? If you want the archetypal judge paradigm from the NSDA, it's like an experienced LD coach, former LD competitor, who's a 4 on speed, who cares about speed but won't vote you down just for going too fast, who wants a value criterion, who cares about the criterion, who wants minimal jargon, who sort of cares about evidence, like a 5 or 6 on evidence, and keeps something of a flow, right? That's the archetypal judge that you want to be ready for at nationals. You'll get variants, but like, imagine if you forgot your paradigms for a round, I would assume that I had 2 of those in the back of every round, because that's sort of the classic nationals judge. So then we get down to the criterion, evidence. Generally what I find is that judges care way more about evidence than you think they do, right? Judges put a lot of 6s and 7s and they tend to mean it as far as nationals go. And evidence is very important at nationals. I think people don't think that because when you hear about a more persuasive, slower, more lay style, people think that comes with less evidence. That's not necessarily true. And then finally, I don't think the rest is worth very much. If someone says they're experienced and they say they keep a rigorous flow, you can trust it. But if someone isn't very experienced and they say they keep a rigorous flow, don't trust it, right? Those sort of things need to be verified against what is reasonable as far as their actual experience with LD goes. I'm trying to remember, there was one paradigm I had this year that freaked me out as far as judge paradigms go. I think it was they were an experienced public forum competitor who said that they were they were a 2 on speed and would vote you down for going too fast, but didn't need a value in criterion, were fine with progressive argumentation and jargon, were a 5 on evidence and said they kept a rigorous flow, and then on their paradigm said that they hadn't ever judged LD before. Those sorts of paradigms are more trouble than they're worth because you don't know what on earth that judge is saying. So that's when you get crazy things like that, that's when you default to what's set in stone, their actual judging experience, right? So that judge has said, I don't know what he's trying to tell me as far as the paradigm goes, but I know that he's a puffy coach. So I'm just going to use what I know about generally what that means. I'm going to use evidence, I'm going to talk in a way that's appealing, and I'm not going to use LD jargon. Even if he says it's okay. He put in his paradigm that he was fine with jargon, but I couldn't trust that because his paradigm was all over the place, and that should always ring warning bells in your head if their paradigm doesn't make sense. Yeah, so here we go. Grab the second page. So you have to look for the holistic picture. You have to build a profile of the judge as a whole. Don't take each section of the paradigm at its word, right? If your judge is saying that jargon is totally fine, but that they don't keep a flow and that you need to speak slowly, one of those things doesn't fit and should be ringing a warning bell. Don't immediately trust it. And then what we always do as a team is for each round, we write down the full paradigm because it helps you remember it. I keep a little book of paradigms with me at all times. And then with a little summary at the top, like this is a medium experienced circuit judge. This is a traditional judge that wants slow speed, right? Just those little tags that you look at right before the round, before you go in and compete. So as far as judge adaptation goes, some of you were with me this morning, and this will be a refresher, but general rules of thumb, you adapt to the, I don't like this phrase, lowest common denominator. So whatever the slowest judge is, that's the speed you go. If one judge says that jargon is unacceptable, then you don't use jargon. There are exceptions to these rules, right? If you have a 5-judge panel, 4 are fine with speed, and 1 says you have to go at a 1, then probably just forget that one judge and read decently quickly. But as a general rule of thumb, you want to go slow, right? Because if you go slow, don't use jargon, and make really good arguments, circuit judges will vote for you. If you go fast and use a ton of jargon, then traditional judges won't vote for you because they won't understand you, right? Default to the lowest common denominator. And then, briefly, I think there's a difference between argument adaptation and style adaptation. I think that progressive debaters do too much argument adaptation and not enough style adaptation. There are some minimal thresholds that you have to meet as far as argument adaptation goes, right? Don't run spec, don't run skep, don't run offensive theory, don't run AFC. But you just have to meet the minimum threshold. Just because you're going to nationals doesn't mean you're running the most obvious stock case you could possibly think of. That is a great way to not do very well at nationals because your ideas are boring, because everyone's heard them, and because they're not necessarily good, right? Nationals does not equal really obvious stock. What it does mean is that you have to be able to make your arguments understandable and compelling for your judges. So again, you've heard me this morning, some of you, but all 3 years that I competed in LD at nationals, I ran Ks with alts on neg. Right? The first 2 years I didn't even know I was doing it. This year I realized I was doing it. But I think that one of the best strategies at nationals is a K with an alt. You just don't call it that because the judges won't understand it if you say it like that. But what I won with this year was a critique of the idea of individual responsibility. I said it was unfair, I said it destroyed communal justice, and that it was discriminatory. And an alternative, which is that we should hold entire communities responsible for failures of justice and look instead towards structural failures like the police, right? That, for those of you who know your K debate, that should be a familiar form. It's a K and an alt. But it all got wrapped up into a value criterion, a contention 1, and a contention 2. And judges bought it, they thought it was interesting, they thought it was compelling, and that's what they ended up voting on, right? You can run way more arguments than you think you can run at the NSDA. You just have to be able to explain them and make sure they're morally compelling. For instance, I would not run ever a language K. I would not run any K that links to the debater rather than the resolutional advocacy. I would never run, no matter what the argument is, any non-topical argument. And if you are going to run a K, your alt has to actually have solvency, right? This is, I think, the biggest barrier to most progressive K debaters. If your solvency is reading a narrative, sorry. If your solvency is continually resisting a method of thought, probably also not going to fly. Whatever your alt is, you have to be able to explain it in picture form, essentially, right? You need to be able to paint a picture of what your alternative world looks like, and your judge needs to be able to inhabit that world in their mind. So you critique the affirmative world, and you can do this in a K way. You can critique the way they think as wrong, and then you present a different way that the judge can inhabit and can imagine and that can see is superior. And I think that's the key towards running things like K debate. Same goes for disadds and counterplans, right? You don't call them that, but last year there were plenty of plan counterplan debates, right, where people on the negative would say that digital privacy was essential to national security, and they would not say in counterplan form, but they would say, here's how we should increase digital privacy in order to lead towards better overall security for the US, right? They would have things like that. They just would run them as a contention in a traditional LD case with a normal framework and all the supporting methods around it. So I think that circuit debaters just default to really boring stock cases and don't think all that much about style adaptation. There's a minimal threshold of argument adaptation. But if at all possible, I believe it is always better to adapt your style than to adapt your arguments. Because once you adapt your arguments too much, you stop doing what makes you good. And I think that that's the line where that's too much adaptation. And I see this a lot. I beat a lot of good circuit debaters, and I saw a lot of good circuit debaters lose because they weren't doing the things that made them good. They would treat their criterion completely different than they would treat standard debate. I ran into and saw circuit debaters who I know are phenomenal at framework debate, who had the weirdest criteria that didn't work as weighing standards, that didn't link, that didn't work on tie. I didn't even know what they were. I was thinking, what are you doing? You are good at this. This is what you do. But they freaked out and they changed their arguments instead of just changing the way they made them. And that took away everything that actually made them a good debater. And then they didn't do well because they didn't have that with them anymore. The last two things I want to talk about as far as adaptation goes is strategic adaptation within a round. This is one of the reasons why I tell people not to read blocks, because you need to read your judges instead. You have to watch your judges and you have to see if my judges are with it, they're getting it, I don't need to explain very much because they're on top of their game, then your blocks get shorter, right? Your extensions get shorter. Maybe you start using jargon, right? If your judges seem to be confused about an argument, if they're getting a little bit lost once the debate speeds up, that's when you extend fewer things and you extend them more thoroughly. And you use fewer answers to and you explain your answers to more. I think that debaters fall into a trap when they just read their 5 answers to every time. Because sometimes 5 decent answers to is a lot worse than 2 fully explained answers to. And that's a call that you, as a debater, have to make on your own in every single round, right? Your coaches will try to help as best they can, but once you're into a round, you need to be capable of making, in the moment, strategic calls about what needs to be done to effectively communicate to your judge. And the last thing I would talk about is relative adaptation to your opponent, right? So, to an extent, not to a great extent, but to an extent, your adaptation should be relative to your opponent's. If your opponent, if say you're in front of a couple of judges that are slow on speed and one judge that is moderate on speed, and your opponent spreads, do you read very slowly and risk dropping a lot, or do you read medium quickly and risk losing the 2 slower judges? I would say option number 2, because the slow judges are not voting for the guy who spread. Not if you're decent, right? You can go a little bit faster than their speed tolerance, but still be much slower than your opponent. And so you'll still be winning in their mind the speed debate. But then that keeps you from dropping a million things and losing out of the blue on a ton of extensions in the NR that suddenly the slower judges voted on, right? I think that the extent to which your opponent adapts gives you a little bit of wiggle room insofar as how much you adapt. However, let's come to the caveat. Again, some of you have already heard this story, but probably the worst instance of adaptation I've ever seen was in a late out round at NSDA. I think it was round 12. It was pretty late in the tournament. There was a 3-judge panel, 2 judges were fine with speed, and 1 was not. And the first guy gets up there, and he is flying in the 180, right? He's full out sprinting. He's going as fast as he can. And we're all thinking, what are you doing, right? 2 of the judges wanted slow speed. Only 1 wanted fast. Now all your opponent has to do is read slower, and he's going to win the round, because the 2 judges are going to vote for him, the other one's going to vote for you. 2-1, this guy wins. The NC gets up there, and he's even faster. He's like one of the fastest spreaders I've ever heard. He is flying, thinking, like, all either of you had to do was bite the bullet and read a little slower, and you get the 2-1. But instead, you got greedy and tried to match your opponent and tried to sweep the 3, right? You said, if he's spreading, that means I can spread. I'm going to be better than him, and I'm going to get all 3 judges. Yeah, well, guess what? The first guy won, because the second guy was even faster, right? What happens is, just because your opponent's not adapting, doesn't mean you don't get to adapt. It just maybe means you have a little more leeway in drawing a hybrid, right? If your opponent spreads, go a little faster, don't get destroyed in the flow. But don't spread just because your opponent spreads. That's a terrible idea. So, finally we're down to lessons learned. I don't know if they quite made the switch. But I'd say the 3 general takeaways, and we can do Q&A, we have a fair bit of time here, is that you win nationals with arguments that are intuitive, that are compelling, and that are understandable. I cannot emphasize those 3 words the most, because I think that is the key to what it means to debate in the national style. I think the second thing that we see is, oh no, I have this on another sheet so I can say it. 1 second. I think the second argument, or the second thing you have to see is that adaptation needs to be done in a quality first way, not in a quantity way, right? Don't do too much adaptation. Don't adapt a lot, adapt well, I guess is what I would say. Don't change everything about your style until you are trying to inhabit the archetypal model of what it is to be a lay debater, because you're not good at that. Do what has to be done to make your judges listen to you, but don't do so much that you lose what makes you who you are and lose what makes you a good debater. I think that's I think that's the biggest barrier to circuit debaters doing as well as they should, because I see circuit debaters inexplicably lose, right? Good debaters, debaters that I respect, debaters that I know are capable of doing the NSA style, lose, or not even break sometimes, because they're not doing what makes them good anymore. They're trying to be someone who they're not. And that's not how adaptation works. And the last thing I would say, as a cautionary note, is that, I guess 2 things that are very destructive ideas in certain communities, which is that compelling arguments and simple arguments are not the same thing. Complicated arguments can be compelling. Unusual arguments can be compelling if they're explained well. When I say run intuitive, compelling arguments, I am not telling you to only run the most obvious stock AC you can think of. What I'm saying is that your arguments need to be capable of persuasion, not that they have to be simple. I think only running simple arguments is not a recipe for success at the NFL. And the last thing I would say is that presenting well is not mutually exclusive to presenting good things, right? Just because you read an argument well does not make it a bad argument. I think that people somehow have this conception of pretty debate and real debate as 2 different things, and it makes them unwilling to carry their skills over, it makes them closed-minded, and it makes them, it gives them a lack of respect that is crippling. If you want to do well at the NSDA, you have to respect the NSDA. If you want to persuade a judge, you have to respect that judge's opinion, and you have to be able to understand and sympathize with and inhabit the way they think about LD, right? There's not one way to do LD, and if you insist there is, then I can't help you as far as doing well at the NSDA goes. So we have a little over 15 minutes, and I'm sure you guys have questions. I went through that fairly quickly, especially because we have coaches here. You guys are good at asking questions. So fire away. Anything you think I missed, anything that you're confused about, anything you tried that you thought would work but it didn't work, anything like that. Yeah?
How many rounds are there to like go all the way to where you went?
It varies from year to year. This year, finals was around 16. Last year, finals was around 17.
So you've been to nationals 3 times, right?
I've been 4 years, but the first
4.
year I went in IX. So
Okay,
3 in LD.
So then just in LD, what changed year to year that like you would say affected your performance? Like, are there specific things that like you focused on?
Yeah, sure. So
Good question.
let's think about this. That's a great question, actually. And I will think for a minute because this deserves a good response. Let's see. I'd say the single most important thing that changed is my understanding of weighing standards. I think that criterion debate and framework clash is kind of the core of what makes traditional debate good. My sophomore year, I kind of had a pivotal moment when I was running a framework on neg. I think it was like transcendentalism or something. And it was one of those standards that was more a mechanism of negating than was actually a way of thinking about the world. And what I mean by that is my opponent got up in cross-examination and said, okay, how do I win if we use your framework? And I was stumped. I said, I don't think you do. Like, I don't think you can win with my framework. And that's not a very good weighing standard, right? A weighing standard should be a way of thinking about a world, not a conclusion about the world, right? If your weighing mechanism is governments are awful, it's not a weighing mechanism, that's an argument, right? Your weighing mechanism needs to be a way of thinking about the round, and then you should use that way of thinking to win, right? But if your way of thinking precludes everything else, like if you can't use it to answer questions about the resolution, then it's bad. The other problem I see people making is using things that are so broad that they aren't real weighing mechanisms. So this was my favorite from this tournament. Correctly assigning moral culpability. Okay, well the problem is that's what the resolution is asking us to do, right? Like, I get that we're supposed to correctly assign moral culpability, but your criterion isn't supposed to tell us that we should do that. It's supposed to tell us how we do that, right? Like, yeah, the way you affirm is by correctly assigning culpability. Your criterion should tell us how we think about culpability, what it means to correctly assign culpability, right? I think that really diving into the weighing standard holds the key to a lot of rounds and will make you realize how often your opponent hasn't. So even in finals, right? The main argument I had against my opponent's framework was it was a very consequentialist theory that said we judge moral culpability based on whether something bad happens. So if you're involved in a situation and something bad happens, you're guilty. The problem is let's think about murder versus self-defense. In both situations, you're involved and someone ends up dead. That's bad. But we don't think self-defense is a crime. We think murder is possibly the worst crime. The difference is why you did it, your intentions, right? That makes a huge difference for us as far as assigning culpability does. And her theory couldn't tell the difference between those two things, right? It thought that murder and self-defense were the same thing, and she said that in cross-examination. That makes it hard to use that as a weighing standard because intuitively we have a lot of concerns about weighing standards that lead to conclusions we find to be clearly false, like self-defense is the same thing as murder. And so I think thinking a lot about weighing standards made the difference from sophomore to junior year, and then made the difference again junior to senior year. Also sophomore to junior year was more time spent researching blocks and better use of blocks within round. So being a little more, I used more of them, but I used them more intelligently, I think, my junior year than my sophomore year. My sophomore year, I didn't have a ton of blocks, and when I did have blocks, I just read them. I really, really do firmly believe that that's a bad way to use them. You need to have lots of blocks, and you need to be smart about how you use them. You need to internalize them and use them holistically, not just reading them.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you debated a variety of different styles of debaters at nationals. My question is, how did you approach different rounds whenever maybe you debated someone that was overly aggressive or someone that maybe didn't have as great of an understanding of debate as you? Because I know that at nationals there are some students that come from maybe weaker districts that will drop an entire case, that type of stuff. And then how did you debate someone that was more progressive in nature that didn't adapt? Like,
okay, so look at those three differently. The first one, as far as debaters who are not as experienced to make clear mistakes that maybe your circuit has trained you to be very aware of. The first thing I would say is that you have to be very respectful, very kind. You can't ever look like you're being mean to someone that doesn't debate the way you do. And the other thing I would say is that you can't get complacent, right? Your opponent might drop your framework, and you might say, yeah, okay, that means I win. Like, round's over, they just finished the NC, I just won, this is gonna be easy. Your judge might have a slightly different outlook on the round. They might be willing to vote on other arguments, right? You need to treat each round as if it is a close round, even in times when it's clearly not. So, right, extend the draw, point at the draw, try to win on the framework debate, but then act as if you're not going to, right? Assume the judge won't vote on the thing you're winning on in those rounds, and do the motions with all the other stuff, because, yeah, those are the worst rounds. I see people lose these rounds, where their opponent makes a huge blunder, they assume they win, and then they lose, because the judge voted on something else. You do not want that to happen to you. That is a terrible feeling. As far as really over-aggressive debaters, one of the things I like about nationals is that the judges are a little more free with their opinions and allow presentation to influence their decisions a little more. That can be a great thing when you're against opponents who are more aggressive. Generally, the way I go is you can't let opponents push you around, but also the more that you can highlight the difference between how they're treating you and how you're treating them is good, right? The phrase, and you should be familiar with this, always in CX, is kill them with kindness, right? If your opponent is being very aggressive and very harsh, very controlling in CX, and is being rude, then you want to respond by being as nice as you possibly can, right? This is one of those instances where just because they're doing it doesn't mean you get to do it. It's the same thing as spreading. As far as circuit kids who don't adapt.
Or I've also seen a trend of kids that I don't normally see on the circuit that are starting to act circuity, that aren't adapting.
We'll rephrase that. Circuit kids who do not adapt.
Yeah.
I guess what I would say is do what you would normally do. Oh, really? I mean, the same rules apply, right?
Yeah.
I think that arguing against a circuit case follows the same philosophy as running a K, right? The arguments are the same. The understanding is the same. The end goal is the same. You just have to do it in a way your judges can understand. You have to speak your judge's language, right? If someone is running, well, actually, here, let's talk about my semifinals round. This might be a good example, right? My opponent's case was a very complicated case about Levinas and the other, which also included a definition that was inaction is when you voluntarily and in full knowledge of the consequences deliberately choose not to act when one could have acted to change the outcome of a situation and one had a legitimate moral obligation to do so. And this is an actual definition, actual source, right? This is what you read at the beginning. That's the most tautological definition I've ever heard, right? The entire point of the affirmative is to prove that that moral obligation exists in the first place. So basically what the round boiled down to is my opponent said, I affirm when the affirmative is true. I was like, well, that seems like my job is kind of hard now, right? In circuit debate, you run T, you run theory, right? Like, that's crazy. It's not topical, it's tautological, leaves no ground for negative, you run ground skew, all this fun stuff. Don't do that, right? All you have to do is say, my opponent's definition is completely tautological. I cannot affirm, I cannot negate if my opponent does this. Here's why it's circular, here's my counter definition. So I say, no violation, no standards, no competing interp, none of that stuff. Just, this is why my opponent's definition leaves me no ground. That's a bad thing. Definitions should be fair. Here's my more fair counter definition, and I moved on. And none of the judges bought his definition, right? So I think that the arguments you make against those sorts of things are fine. It's just, I mean, perhaps in more circuit language, don't offer competing interps, assume reasonability, that sort of stuff. Like, you can make arguments as to why things are abusive or unfair or all that sort of stuff. Just do it in the language that judges will understand, right? Traditional LD, people call out abuse, right? People do abusive things and people argue against abusive things and say you shouldn't listen to it. It happens all the time. It just doesn't happen in the sort of hyper-structured theory debate format that circuit is used to. As far as weird cases, right? So same round, this Levinas thing was bizarre, right? It was about love of the other and accepting, yeah, I mean, the fact that I can't explain it should explain exactly how bizarre it was. It was confusing. Same rules as any other tournament, right? Try to translate the argument into terms you understand. Don't panic just because you don't understand it. Assume your judges probably, that's one of the nice things about NSDA, is that unlike some tournaments, your judges won't understand stuff that you don't understand, which is nice, right? If you are an intelligent person who flows well and listens well, your understanding of their arguments is probably as good or better than your judge's understanding of those arguments. Which means that if you make the best arguments you can against that case, your judge will probably listen to them and probably understand them. So, in those situations, I think my biggest advice is don't panic and relapse into circuit habits, right? Don't panic and run the T-shell. Don't panic and run theory. Don't panic and try to outspread them because you don't understand their case, right? Keep your cool, do what you have to do, and don't abandon language that your judges understand. Other questions? I think we do still have some time here.
18 doesn't.
Yes.
Can I suggest one thing?
Mhm.
Do you mind? I tell my students at any tournament, but at NSTA in particular, the most important resource you have is the judge's attention, and you need to do everything you can to get it and maintain it. Allow me to explain. On Sunday, all judges in the pool will get what is affectionately known as their dance card, which is the number of rounds that they're going to judge, right? And you will know on Sunday that you're supposed to be in North Tower 385 at 11 o'clock. Let's say things don't go well and your kids are done on Tuesday by noon, and you don't fly out till Saturday or so. You're not happy to be there. You want to be sightseeing, you really want to be home, but you can't afford to change your ticket. There are many situations but you have to be there, because if you don't, you're going to lose a judge bond of several $100s. So your school kind of wants you to bring that back. Those people sometimes are annoyed that they have to be in that situation, and you have to do something to entertain, to persuade, something along those lines, because their state of mind very well may not be quite as fresh and willing to listen as it was on Monday morning at 8 o'clock. Does that make sense to everyone? So the idea of, you've debated 14, 15 rounds maybe at that point, but you have to act as though it is round one. You're delivering the case, the first time you ever did it, after, during the tournament, with the same level of passion, engagement, etc. And I think that's really important, and sometimes we slip into bad habits as the round goes on. And I think maintaining the judge's attention is really important. I would also suggest to you that don't worry about who you're debating. Sometimes you'll say, oh, I'm debating blah, blah, blah student, and they've done really well, and I've seen them on debate websites. Oh no, forget that. You're debating to try to pick up the judges who are in the back of the room, who most times in NSDA have not heard of the other kid, which is an advantage for you. And at that point, you just go in and you do your thing, and your job is to persuade either 2 individuals in prelims, or most times 3 individuals for most of the elims, that you're the smarter kid, and you're making the best and most reasonable arguments. And you're debating for whoever the 2 people are, not necessarily for the other person. Don't let them change what you do well. And I think Nikki has done a good job in trying to say that, but just wanted to highlight that as well. That is extremely important.
Definitely. So we're about out of time. So the last thing I'd like to leave you with, and I think it trails on this idea of being able to hold your judge's attention, is I think first of all, think about NSDA not as a chore, but as an opportunity. I think, obviously, I love it. I think it's best tournament out there. And the reason I do is because it offers an opportunity to do something that you don't always get to do, which is to only run arguments that you legitimately believe in. I think that on either side of the resolution, the name of the game is finding those points that you actually believe, right? These questions are not easy questions. So ask yourself, why can't I make up my mind? What about each side do I find compelling? And make that your case. Run the arguments you believe. How on earth are you ever going to get anyone else to actually believe you? And I think that's something you should always bear in mind at this tournament, is you have to believe what you're saying, you have to care about what you're saying, and you have to be, and if you do that, then everyone around you will be able to see that. Everyone else will be able to see that, and that has a power that is hard to quantify.
I too would agree with the gentleman. That is the national championship tournament. I like the TOC, I like NDCA, I would like to win them all, but I would far rather win NSDA because not every student has the opportunity, the privilege to go to some of those other tournaments, either due to coach choices, due to money, due to state regulations, and that is the true national championship, in my opinion.
I think I have a question. I think I already asked you this question, but I guess for you specifically. Or if anyone in the room actually.
None of mine. I don't want to hijack your thing, but yeah.
What would you suggest doing? I have a district. I'm from Houston, so
Yes.
that is very, very progressive. So in order to get to a traditional tournament, you have to be a circuit debater. So I don't know.
Right?
Hmm?
You're Kingwood?
Yeah.
Okay, so he's in my district where we have progressive kids and not progressive judges at districts.
It's almost like a different in every way you go along to get to the NSDA tournament. I mean, I guess would it just be making circuit progressive style cases and then finally, or not?
No, it would be quite the opposite. It would be adapting my message to fit the judge. I could care less what they say. They could go in and do their circuit thing. You have to just make arguments that make sense. And I'm very familiar with your district. And sometimes, the circuit people get through. Sometimes they don't adapt. Sometimes people think it's just slowing down ridiculous circuity cases and treating people as they're stupid is the approach to adapting, and I fundamentally disagree with that. I think it's fairly obnoxious. My answer would be have mainstream cases that make sense to adult critics who think about debate as, two smart kids making smart arguments without all the tricks. I wouldn't say have a bunch of traditional cases. The other progressive cases. I would have stuff that appeals to the judges that you have. And that kind of ties into what I said before, and we should probably transition, and anybody can ask me later, but winning really at the end of the day is all about the judges, right? Is it about who you have on the other side of the room? 100%. But at the end of the day, there will be adults of varying backgrounds, experiences, who have a variety of biases, and your job is to try to win over more of them than not in any given situation. And most circuit kids don't know how to adapt anymore, I think. They just don't.
Yeah.
And so you almost have an advantage, it seems to me, if you're in that situation.
I was originally a very, very traditional debater, but then I felt like because of the district we're in, I've been having to almost change to more of a progressive debate to be sometimes successful. But then when I travel outside of our district, I actually can be traditional or change my way, I guess. It just depends on.
Don't play their game, play your game well.
Yeah.
And if the judges are more in line ideologically with your game, that seems to make sense to me. So.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. You're great.
Did not mean to hijack